Hello and welcome. It's with great pleasure that I welcome you all to this special event, a virtual Indian launch of a very timely new book by Charles Kupchan, Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World. Charles, who is a professor of international affairs at Georgetown University and also a senior fellow at Council on Foreign Relations, is with us today to talk about his new book, its key arguments, and some of its more contemporary policy implications. Welcome, Charles, and heartiest congratulations on this wonderful and timely book. To discuss this book's many interesting claims and to offer an informed critique, we have a panel of three very distinguished discussants with us: Ambassador Meera Shankar, India's former ambassador to the US; Dr. C. Raja Mohan, Director, Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore; and Professor K.P. Vijayalakshmi, Professor of American Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. A very warm welcome to you all as well. The debate on American isolationism has been one of the central aspects of international relations over the last few years and has manifested most starkly by many claims and moves of Mr. Trump, the current US president, as well as his America First claim. The US is in the midst of a very contentious election in which two very starkly different visions of governance are being presented to the US and to the world. But there's this lingering sense of American retrenchment there which refuses to go away. And yet this contestation around the scale and scope of America's global engagement is nothing new. As this new book by Charles points out, isolationism has indeed been the dominant theme of American foreign policy if you look at it in the broad sweep of history. And this book traces that entire arc from the era of the Founding Fathers to all the way to the Trump presidency in a very cogent and readable manner. And therefore, it's a very, very important addition into the literature on American foreign policy, as well as to assess contemporary American foreign policy through a historical lens. Without further ado, let me invite Charles to talk about his new book and to delineate the book's central arguments before I go to the three discussants for their presentations. May I also suggest those who are joining us for this session, please keep on sending us your questions, comments, and observations. We'll be happy to take them in the second half of this event. Charles, over to you.
Thank you very much, Harsh, and thanks to you and Samir and the whole ORF team for hosting this event, and also let me express my gratitude to the three very distinguished discussants for taking the time to engage in the conversation today. I'm honored to be sharing the virtual podium with such distinguished guests. I thought maybe to get the conversation going, I would touch on perhaps three revelations that struck me as I was writing the book, and in doing so, I'll also talk a little bit about why I wrote the book and when the idea of writing a book on isolationism came to mind. So the first revelation was that when I first began to look back at American history, in particular pre-1941 American history, I was dumbfounded. In fact, my head kind of exploded, because the country that I was reading about bears such little resemblance to the country that I was living in the sense that, I went to graduate school in the 1980s. I then started teaching as the Berlin Wall was coming down. So I only knew American internationalism, the Cold War, the unipolar moment, the response to 9/11. And when I started reading American history about what the country was like before 41, it was a dramatic, different picture. From the beginning, from 1789 until 41, the United States generally shunned strategic commitments outside North America. The U.S. was an avid trader from the very beginning. The U.S. used its military forces to defend its trading interests. The U.S. expanded ruthlessly across North America, grabbing a big chunk of Mexico along the way. But it did not go further. It did not take on colonies. It did not expand into Central America or Latin America, the Caribbean, the Pacific. All of these issues were debated, and the answer was always the same: No. And then you have a burst of expansionism in 1898, and then you have World War I, but then the U.S. public says, we don't much like this. We'd rather go back to where we were before 1898. And that's when you get the very stubborn isolationism of the 1920s and the 1930s. And so I was just struck by how different the United States was prior to the post-World War II era. And just to give you one quick story to demonstrate the power of the isolationist narrative, in 1778, when the United States, or the colonies as they were, decided to break away from the United Kingdom, the war didn't go well. And as a consequence, the founders, who did not want to form alliances with anybody, ended up forming an alliance with the French. And the French essentially pulled our chestnuts out of the fire. Had it not been for the French, we probably would have lost the Revolutionary War. Anyway, the French came over, we won the war, declared independence, began life as a federation in 1789. And then a few years later, in 1793, war breaks out again between Britain and France. And the French say to George Washington, hey, remember that alliance that we formed in 1778? Well, now it's your turn to help us. And what does George Washington do? He basically says, good night, good luck, you're on your own. And he issues a proclamation of neutrality that basically says we are unwilling to honor the alliance with France. That was the last alliance the United States had until after World War II. So from 1793, when Washington committed a bald act of infidelity, until the 1940s, the United States basically said, we want no alliances. And it was George Washington in his farewell address who said, the great rule of conduct for us when it comes to foreign policy is commercial ties with everyone, political connections to no one. And indeed, when Woodrow Wilson decided to enter World War I in 1917, he refused to call the United States an allied country. He said we are an associate power because he feared the backlash if he used the word ally. So anyway, that's just a quick anecdote that will, I think, help the audience understand the strength of this isolationist and this unilateralist impulse in American politics. The second revelation that I want to share with everyone is that I found a very different conception of American exceptionalism informing American isolationism. Since my involvement in this field as a teacher, as a scholar, as a practitioner, American exceptionalism has really been a justification for going out and changing the world. Right? We went into Iraq to bring democracy to the Middle East. We went into World War I and World War II to save the world for democracy and transform autocracies into liberal democracies through occupying Germany and Japan. And there has been this powerful narrative that is part of the American political DNA that essentially says we are the indispensable nation, we are the chosen nation, we have an obligation to transform the world. Well, until 1941, that narrative was quite different. And it basically posited that yes, the United States was an exceptional nation, but it needed to keep the world at bay. It needed to push the world away to preserve that experiment. Because if it didn't do that, foreign ambition abroad would come at the expense of domestic liberty and prosperity. And in many respects, isolationism was to American politics for the 19th century what internationalism is today, largely because this exceptionalist narrative basically dictated geopolitical detachment. We will tend our own garden, we will perfect our union, but we will not attempt to do more. We will lead only by example. That narrative starts to change in the 1890s. McKinley justifies the Spanish-American War and the invasion of Cuba on the basis of taking manifest destiny abroad, bringing democracy and Christianity to places like Cuba and the Philippines. But after the United States became an empire, taking over and occupying Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, Samoa, the Wake Islands, Americans justifiably said, what are we doing? You told us we were going abroad to bring democracy and civilization, and we've turned into an empire. And that really was the predicate to the turn inward that came afterward. My final observation, and again a revelation, is that even though Donald Trump and America First was for 99% of Americans a bolt from the blue, a big slap in the face because it broke with the traditions that guided the United States from Franklin Roosevelt through Barack Obama, it was not new. Trump was really reaching back to the America First mantra of the interwar era. The America First Committee, after all, opened its doors in 1940 to block potential U.S. entry into World War II. And the isolationist, unilateralist, nativist, and racist, protectionist tinge to America First was all very much part of American grand strategy prior to World War II. So in many respects, Donald Trump has been more in sync with American history than out of step with American history. And as I was living here, watching him win the election, watching him take office, watching him in his inaugural address say, today it is America first, I was already writing the book, and it was like, wow, he is going back to this different strain in American history, this different political culture, this different element in America's past. And I think one needs to understand that in understanding Donald Trump. My final observation is that I think where we are today, obviously on the cusp of what is arguably the most important election in American history, is a point at which the United States does need to bring its foreign commitments back into line with its political will. I am not a big fan of Donald Trump. In fact, I think he is a dangerous, dangerous leader for America and for the world. But I do think that we need to harvest lessons, and one of those lessons is the American people are tired of the forever wars, and they want the president to focus on the home front. And I do think a key task for the next president, be it Biden or be it Trump, is to find that middle ground between doing too much, which is where we have been, and doing too little, which is where we were prior to this burst of internationalist enthusiasm. The United States needs to step back, but not to step away. And so I think we do need to see an open, rich debate here in the United States about where to step away, how to step away. Trump has tried, but he's made a mess of it. Pulling out of Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Germany by tweet without an accompanying diplomatic strategy, leaving allies alienated and adversaries strengthened. That's not the way to go about bringing commitments back into line with political will. But I do think that that kind of retrenchment is coming. If it doesn't happen by design, it could potentially happen by default as we see this isolationist instinct reawaken. So my plea is for the next president to take this task seriously, to begin to retrench from the Middle East so that we can continue to maintain more important strategic commitments in Europe and in South and East Asia, and to go back to being a team player and a multilateralist and a coalition builder. Because I do think if the U.S. is going to step back from playing the role of global policeman, and I do think that we are in the process of doing that, we're going to need partners around the world, including India, to help us guide a world that is heading toward multipolarity and will therefore be much more difficult to manage. I will stop there and look forward to the comments of my friends on the screen.
Thank you, Charles. In a very brief, in a nutshell, you laid out the central claims of the book. And I think what I find fascinating is this discussion on how did this sense of exasperation with American foreign policy started to reflect itself around the world. If I recall correctly, it was the end of George W. Bush administration where there was this fatigue with forever wars, with these two big wars that America was fighting. And even under Mr. Obama, you felt it, if you were outside America, you felt it more vividly, because I think perhaps in America the debates were not as polarized, but for the rest of the world it looked as if America is on that verge of re-evaluating its options. And I think that was certainly the trend lines that you map out very, very clearly in the book. Ambassador Shankar, I would like to come to you now for the first set of remarks.
Thank you, Harsh. Charles, first of all, may I compliment you on a very timely book. It makes it clear to all of us that President Trump and his isolationism and America First policy are not a bolt from the blue or only because of his individual proclivities, but also reflect a continuing tendency in the American tradition going all the way back to the founding fathers. And as you've said, while isolationism acquired very negative connotations in terms of the reluctance of the US to enter the Second World War, it entered only after it was attacked in Pearl Harbour. Isolationism in the past brought benefits to America. It allowed it to expand territorially westward. It avoided, foreign entanglements, as Washington said, and facilitated American consolidation and economic development, and provided natural security by way of its geographical separation from other great powers. So there has been this tendency in the US to go back to isolationism periodically, as you say, when means and objectives are not in alignment, when objectives, foreign policy objectives, have far outrun the means to be able to achieve them, and B, when the US has not felt under threat. In some sense, the experience of the Second World War and the challenge posed by the communist ideology engineered an imminent threat to the US, which led to the activism, the building of alliances, the Marshall Plan, and so on, and the emergence of American internationalism. You saw that again when the US felt threatened by international terrorism after September 11th. Again, there was this imminent threat, and people came together to support actually a more interventionist approach, including the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But it soon evaporated as these appeared like never-ending conflicts with no easy resolution, putting a drain on US resources and manpower. Now, from the Indian point of view, if we look at US interventionism in that unipolar moment after the collapse of the Cold War, when the imminent threat from communism had abated to a considerable extent, then you see that the intervention in Afghanistan at some level, should have perhaps been concentrated without really going into Iraq. But what we saw instead was that after the initial success of America's military intervention, America virtually outsourced Afghanistan policy to Pakistan, allowing the Taliban and Al-Qaeda to escape into Pakistan and regroup. Because it turned its attention to Iraq, where you had a weakened Saddam who posed no threat at all to the United States. So we are not sure what the rationale was, but clearly Iraq had no role in September 11th. Getting involved in Iraq, I think, undermined the US ability to actually handle Afghanistan. During Obama's term, and we see that the strategic overreach of the Bush years was already leading to a reaction during the campaign that President Obama ran, because he talked of the need to concentrate resources for national development and to end these wars which he inherited. You could say that he really inherited a crown of thorns, an ongoing war leading nowhere in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and the global financial crisis, the collapse. So a crown of thorns, if you will. But yet, when he came to office, he got sucked into Libya and he got sucked into Syria, because neither of these again posed any great threat to the United States. Libya had an autocratic regime, but relatively stable, with Colonel Gaddafi in power. Again, a secular regime. Post the intervention, there's been chaos and civil war in Libya. And you could say the same thing for Assad in Syria, that at some level he provided stability in a very diverse, religiously diverse country with Shia, Sunnis, and Alawites, and so on, and held that country together. So both these to us, looking at it from outside, showed the inability of the US to extricate itself from interventions. In some of these cases in Libya, it was the Europeans who really took the lead. I think there is need, as you say, for the US to consider very carefully its external engagements and to cut back in a deliberate and considered way. And you have identified cutting back from the Middle East as the most prudent thing for the US to do, while preserving its deployments and engagements in Europe and the Far East to be able to handle the threat of Russia and China. Now here I'd like to pose one question, and that is that, has the US completely ruled out a Nixon moment with Russia? Because at some level, US policy is pushing Russia towards China, has pushed and continues to push Russia towards China. The sanctions that have been imposed on Russia post-Ukraine have led to Russia seeking energy markets in China, quickly enabling the two to arrive at a price agreement which they hadn't been able to do in years of negotiations, setting out the pipelines, looking at stepping up their defense equation. And you have the most recent statement by President Putin when asked, would Russia contemplate a defense agreement or defense pact with China? And he said, yes, we could contemplate it, though I see no reason for it right now. So I think there is need for the US in a realpolitik sense to calibrate, because China poses, from our perspective, the far greater existential threat to the US built international order because of its greater capacities, particularly in the economic and technological field. And those capacities will enable China to quickly build its military and strategic capacities also to be a bigger challenge to the United States. So concentrating to some extent on China from our point of view looks desirable, and in that process perhaps moderating some of the harsh edges of US policy towards Russia might be helpful. So that's a question I would like to pose to you. For the rest, I completely agree with you that if the US doesn't, debate and very deliberately and in a measured and considered way, decide how it wants to step back from its foreign engagements, particularly its military interventions, then it will happen by default, and it could be extremely disruptive for the global order. In Asia, obviously, we would be interested in knowing how the US will proceed to help build a more sustainable balance vis-a-vis China, and what role other countries, including alliance partners as well as strategic partners like India, can play in this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Shankar. And I think the last point that she made, I think, is very interesting in the sense of looking at the future of alliance relationships, because a large part of American enterprise around the world is based on these alliances. And increasingly, we live in a world where we are talking of like-minded partnerships, coalitions of the willing, issue-based alignments. So are we moving away from the old structure of alliances to a more fluid mechanisms of managing these relationships, in particular for America, which has relied on these structured alliances, a hub and poke system, which was initially called, to manage its centrality to the global order. Raja, can I invite you now for your observations, comments, and if
Thanks for inviting me for this discussion. So let me just make 3 sets of points in the short time that I had. First is to congratulate Charles for this book. Those of us who write books, timing is everything, and I think if you get the timing right, half the job is done, because the way the book has come out exactly at the right moment, just before the 2020 elections, and touching on something that is really at the very core of the American debate. I mean, there's no real debate between the candidates, but all the issues that are figuring in the election, whether it's alliances, trade, whether it's liberal internationalism, multilateralism, use of force, every one of them is out there in some form or the other. And I think your book touches it, all of them quite well. What surprised me was that you were surprised. I mean, that how much America was isolationist before the Second World War. In fact, that's part of the problem in India is even worse, or much of Asia, where I now live in East Asia, is even worse, because none of us have learned or were even encouraged to learn the complex history of America's international. I was saying that Charles was surprised that how little the Americans know about their own past. The stories are much the same in the rest of the world, because most of us do not really pay attention to America's past. And given America's dominance of the world over the last 70 odd years, it's really through either bilateral means or we took internationalism for granted. So we are as surprised as the American establishment is when Trump comes and questions all the holy assumptions of the American internationalism in the last 4 years. And I think your book does a great service to suggest that this is not some crazy coot who's trying to disrupt the system, but actually he's, whether intellectually aware or not, is tapping into something which is very deep-rooted in the US history. So I think that itself, so I hope we can get a shorter version for rest of Asia to most of us to see that there is a complex story here and that we must be prepared for the transition. What you say, your main conclusion, it should not be, US should not be stepping away, it should not be stepping back, but it should stay engaged in a different form. That I think is not fully understood. Many of us here in Singapore and East Asia just pray that Biden will come back and US-China will go back to normal. Happy days are here again. I mean, that assumption that is being made, I suspect will be disillusioned once we have even with a Biden victory. So that's the first point. Second, I think your promise to make the book a go-to book on American isolationism, I think works very well. And the fact that you treat isolationism as a legitimate phenomenon and not something extremist, as much as the mainstream media, the academic complex tells us, it is somehow a derangement rather than a structural issue. So I think that way you do, really, that way the book is immensely enjoyable because it's so different from the multiple institutions that we constantly see America through their lens. So I think a corrective is certainly useful. But I have three issues in terms of how you frame the whole debate. It's a long, I think you laid it out beautifully through history. One is in terms of the definition itself. If isolation is defined as staying away from Europe, but as you yourself say in the book and you said in the opening remarks, the US was expansive power, both in its own surroundings, took territory from the neighbors, was dominating the southern, Western hemisphere as a whole. So how do you square that? I mean, that is, some would say that is imperialist, that is hegemonic, while staying away from Europe is also true, that there is a tension here that going to Europe is internationalism, but dominating Western hemisphere was really isolationism. So I think there is a tension here that needs to be squared up. I mean, I think how you do it, but I think that's both are true, but I think they need to reconcile that. The second, I think, tension in the book is really about economics. That, all of us, those who do political science, I mean, generally think it is international relations is a story of political ideas. Those who do international economics and those who do international politics, there's very little relationship. But at least at this point of time, we should say, look, what were the interests of American capital or the nature of the American economy that produced foreign policies that suited it, right? And then, of course, the capital doesn't always get away with what it wants. There is resistance from the rednecks, from the working classes, from, your own book documents. So I think somehow the Americans' international engagement must be connected to the evolution of American economy, American capital, the transition from agrarian capital to industrial capital, now from industrial to digital capital, and what it does to the US interests abroad and how it needs to secure those interests. You'd say 1898 was a good turning point when America becomes #1 industrial power. How it deals with the rest of the world fundamentally changes. So if you're a Marxist and a determinist, you say, look, there you are. The structure of America's economic interests has changed. Therefore, it had to take a different view of the world. But I think that story of the economic story, the rise of American capital and what its interests were beyond trade, now it's looking at the world in a different way. And I think explaining some of that would be wonderful. The third issue, I hope you can touch on it, which is really, last time we met, I was talking about your essay 10 years ago, exactly, in international security, when you wrote about the dead center, how America's domestic politics was not going to support the liberal internationalist enterprise. And you wrote this in 2010. That's exactly what happened in the last, we saw parts of it, as Harsh said, in the Obama period, and most starkly now under Trump. You still believe that a liberal international enterprise is not sustainable domestically, because domestic politics of America has changed, that the tendency in Washington, of course, to think somehow foreign policy is autonomous from domestic politics, but that's no longer true, and you pointed that out long ago. So where do you stand on that proposition? It would be interesting to know. The third point I wanted to make was really come to the current situation, which is really how you see the current dynamics in Washington and how they might play out after the election. The tension between internationalism and isolationism, at least clearly, sitting outside, expresses itself in 4 areas quite clearly. One is on trade and economics. That is, as Trump says, liberal trading order has not worked for the American working class. Therefore, I am representing them. It is saving American jobs. Now, traditionally, the Republicans were for free trade, and the Democrats were supporting the working class interests. We have this wonderful inversion today, where the Democrats have become free traders, and the Trump's Republicans have become protectionists. That's an interesting inversion that has taken place. And Biden is fudging the issue, whether he'll actually support free trade. He's kind of finessing it, but we'd love to see where that would play out after the election. Second, I think on the endless wars, the rhetoric on the Democratic side has changed, but will the establishment allow Biden to go to do what you want to do, what him to do, which is tone down, reduce the expansive international engagement. Third is the alliances. Trump wants to destroy them, at least. He says, look, alliances are free riders. They don't do anything for America. So now the question is, Biden says, no, I'm all for alliances. I'm going to rebuild the alliances. So where do you see that going? Because that's really, will the Biden people move from the focus on alliances to like-minded coalitions, which Harsh referred to in his talk? So I think that's, again, is an interesting question. Can you really put the Humpty Dumpty back? If you look at alliances, Turkey is supposed to be a member of NATO. South Korea is supposed to be a member of US bilateral alliance. You think Thailand and Philippines are the oldest American allies in Asia. You see what's going on here. I don't know if the Humpty Dumpty can be put back. And if the Humpty Dumpty can't be put back, what is the alternative that you can think? So that brings me to the last issue, I think, which is really, and then the China question, which is a big thing. You have Trump, the China plague, is going to confront it, and he's going to punish them for it. While Biden says exactly the opposite of what Mira wants America to do. Russia is a threat, China is only a competition. That's what Biden is saying in his last interview to 60 Minutes. I can see the interests of American Wall Street is for more trade. They're not for decoupling. Today, entire Silicon Valley is tied into China. They don't want decoupling. So if the Democrats supporters want to go back to pre-Trump era on the China question, then what it does to the rest of Asia, a lot of Asians would welcome it. But others would also see this is actually one more turn at the American unpredictability and how we're going to deal with it. So my question is, you want a Goldilocks solution, which is not too hot, not too cold, not too active, not too isolationist, not too long, not too short, but step back but not step away. How do you see this playing for a Biden coalition? Because there are internationalists, there are left-wing isolationists, there are socialists, those who want to do Green Deal and they think China is the most important partner in that. So I think you have a messy coalition. So let's imagine tomorrow is the first day of a Biden administration. How do you see these contradictions playing out in a Biden coalition that today hangs together because of Trump? The moment you take Trump away, the contradictions are going to come pretty sharply into public view. Thank you, Harsh.
Thank you, Raja. And if I may add, to what you said, it's this point about American domestic contestations and American domestic categories is a very important one. I think in particular, while one can look at the George W. Bush administration and the forever wars that it has spawned, For a lot of the rest of the world, it was liberal internationalism actually in 1990s that started these wars in the name of liberal internationalism that generated this backlash against American unipolarity. So I think that was when you see 1990s, go back to the Bill Clinton and his wars, you really see how India was also at the forefront talking about all it was being done multilaterally. I think that the arguments that were being made were from the rest of the world, from a large part of the rest of the world, these were problematic. So if you look at liberal internationalists in the 1990s, then you had the neoconservatives and you had the centrist Republicans. You had that coalition which was willing to project power in the name of the public good, in the name of values. And I think that how is that shaping up in the age of Trump, and whether, as you move forward, I think some of the issues that Raja talks about, in the Democratic coalition become very, very interesting, and how the impact that this debate on what kind of a footprint America is going to have becomes very interesting. So we would love to have your thoughts on that. But before that, let me go to Professor Vijayalakshmi for the final set of comments from our discussants. Professor.
Hello. Hi. Thank you, Harsh. And I'm delighted to be part of this panel. And I do echo my fellow presenters, Meera and Raja's congratulations to Dr. Kupchan. We have followed you for many years, and I think some of it, I'll have to start by saying that this strain of isolationism is partly what we teach at the American Studies in the JNU. In fact, I teach a course on contemporary American themes and contemporary themes in American history. And we start, in fact, with the isolationism, exceptionalism, and the way it plays out in their foreign policy. So your book is not only timely, it's very useful for this millennial generation, which only looks at everything that's on the internet and doesn't really want to haunt the libraries and find ways of making sense of a very complex and a complicated American history. But having said that, there are 3 or 4 points which you make, which I thought was really interesting, and I have made these points earlier when I talked about Mr. Trump's foreign policy as well. One of them is about a reinterpretation of American exceptionalism, which you talk about in 1890s. And right from the beginning, your arguments have been about why America chose to be part of a strong, inward-looking, secure homeland until the first time when, after 9/11, the attack on the homeland, till that happened, American thinking has always been that foreign policy begins at home. So, I recall Richard Haas's book, that Foreign Policy Begins at Home, also talks about how they, any, what shall I say, any kind of not giving enough attention to the domestic issues would lead you to actually step back in your foreign policy commitments. In fact, it would lead you to lose credibility. It would not only attack your soft power, but it would also probably have an impact, especially if you have an economic decline or a relative decline on your hard power as well. So to sell alliances, to sell your credibility as the indispensable nation, as the exceptional nation, you still needed a domestic base in which, of course, the Congress and the public and the foreign policy elite and all of the other actors that you have mentioned. So your book, in many ways, deals with all of that throughout the history of U.S. foreign policy. And I think that really made this book very special, very enjoyable, and it speaks volumes that, this is something my students would certainly identify with, because, there is so much that we talk about the conceptualization of exceptionalism and isolationism, and also suggest causes and explanations as to why and when does America break with that thinking. And that, I think, has been the special contribution in this book, outlining the causes for embracing internationalism when they were so vehemently isolationist for a very long period of time. And one of them you mentioned was Manifest Destiny, the messianic flavor, etc. But more interestingly, which I find very, very probably tucked away somewhere, but I can't remember the page, but it says when the countries begin to have economic success, they tend to go outside and they would like to do more geopolitical expansion. So does that explain China? Came to my mind straight away. You know, is that what you think? I mean, do you think that today China's expansionism, its assertive arguments have been made about Chinese assertive behavior, its aggression, etc. But the recognition of China threat, whether it is, as Biden's camp says, competitor, strategic competitor is what Mr. Bush had said, or it is a real serious threat to the world at large. So, you know, this pan-American understanding of China's threat and the China challenge, managing that China challenge, does this rest on your understanding? I would like you to tell me, you know, whether this economics has made, China go outside and begin its expansionism, because that's one of the things that you started. But the other important thing that you keep talking about is the movement of America from being a exemplar, which is the isolationist position of we should lead by example and not go out from Quincy Adams' time of monsters to destroy, to becoming a crusader for human rights and so on. And again, this brings me back to what Raja said, and to some extent what Ambassador Shankar said, that does this mean that human rights, and that would in fact become an important factor again in the next 4 years. I'm not challenging at all your point about this strong creed, because I have argued elsewhere that this tapping of this political thought in American psyche or DNA has been why Trump won, and it probably would outlive even after November the 3rd elections, whoever may be the winner. So I think that's another important thing for me to talk about. The other important things that I found very interesting was about America's domestic, public, and its impact on foreign policy. I recall historian Walter Mead, who visited our center. He did tell me that, you know, there is this disconnect between the elite and the public at large. And that's probably what Mr. Trump actually speaks about right through his campaign speeches, his campaigns now, and even the first campaign, and through the years. He's been talking about the silent majority. He's talked about the shy supporters and the ones who do not want to speak out, but basically saying that the foreign policy establishment is essentially something which the Americans don't really want. What is your take on that? Is there a disconnect between what the foreign policy elite and what the public really wants? Because I'm seeing that from 2017, when 85% of them in the polls, various polls as you know very well, have said that, you know, terrorism was the main issue, etc. And today only 46% or something. And I'm surprised. I mean, why that sudden drop? Do they believe that ISIS is completely defeated and Al-Qaeda is now in their hand? And of course, Taliban, the negotiations are going well. What do they believe in? I mean, what brings this 42%? That seems to me a very critical kind of pointer to what the campaigns and the politicians would look at in terms of reinterpreting a step forward or away from this isolationist impulse. At this point, I think it's still an impulse. It's an inflection point, which again you did point out. Now, there's another point that I thought which really bears a little more examination, and here I'd like to ask you. You did talk about secular expansionism. I'm not quite clear. The brand of secular expansionism and the decline in religious messianism, you say that it should be exceptional. U.S. should be exceptional for what it was, not for what it did. But that, runs into contradictions that we've all seen. The touting of human rights and, values, democratic values, but at the same time, arm in arm with almost all the strongmen, autocratic leaders, etc. You know the whole points. I don't need to labor that at all. So explain to me, how would you talk about secular expansionism or a secular foreign policy? Would you have some thoughts on that? I'd be very interested in listening to that. I also think there's another big strain which you bring out very, very nicely, and that is about nation building at home. How do you think this nation building at home, which began with even Clinton, it's the economy is stupid, I still remember that, and it went on, and then, of course, George Bush said, we are not going to be a nanny for the world. We're not going to hold hands with all kinds of people. We're going to let this speak for itself, that kind of thinking. So nation building at home, which also started a debate around the world, I'd say, but in India at least. There was a lot of debate on the relative or American decline. I have myself participated in several debates on whether America is declining, not declining, etc. So this nation building at home, is that going to be the new word for isolationism, or an inward turn? And standing back or standing by. America was aloof. Several conflicts, as you have very clearly put us through the historical turnings that happened and the churnings that happened. But having said that, you have also mentioned that staying aloof hadn't really helped. America had to come back and get involved and engage. So is nation building going to stop international engagement, or is there going to be selective engagement, which I remember during, I think, an earlier Democratic administration, selective engagement was also part of the thinking. I think there was a certain amount of writing. Warren Christopher had penned an essay in Foreign Affairs, I think. Nevertheless, my point is that what is this nation building at home, whether a Democrat would do that, or is it the Republican-Democrat divide? The polarization that you briefly take us through. Again, I would like you to actually tell us whether this polarization on both sides, would that affect this fundamental process of forming or making? We know that the Congress is divided in partisan ways. So the role of Congress, you've repeatedly brought in Congress and how they try to restrain any president who was adventurous enough to go abroad when there was too many domestic problems, or even otherwise because of their isolationist belief. So is Congress, again, do you think Congress, with its authorization of use of force kind of legislations, with other kinds of legislations, is it possible that you're thinking that Congress may again play a role in guiding and restraining the presidency into a more reasonable and what you want as a restrained foreign policy in terms of the next administration or the years to come? I think that would again be important. Finally, I think about withdrawing from alliances, withdrawing from commitments. If that continues to be the way America explains its, if you explain it as part of its isolationism, and you do mention social unrest, you talk about crumbling infrastructure, you talk about the need for economic inequalities to be addressed at home, racism, xenophobia. You mention a number of things which are essentially clearly a product of the last 10 years, I would say, of what America has been going through. But I would argue that if you talk about disengaging by moving back from your already existing commitments, how do you think that would work in, let's say, shoring up your security? Because after all, these alliances were made with a certain amount of deliberation and circumspection about safeguarding your own interests and values. It's never been just interest, it's always been values and interests. So how does that withdrawal, say, from NATO, from NATO, of course, you got another one instead of NATO, but commitments already in Europe, the withdrawal or, asking for defense burden sharing, I understand, is a different way of saying, that, look, you need to pull your weight, which Obama started. And again, I'm indebted to you for making that very clear. Trump, in many ways, has been following a path of continuity in some of these policies. And he has, however, changed some of them far more dramatically. And this engagement in security is one. The second part of it is the disengagement in economic alliances or economic partnerships. How does that help the United States? I mean, does the United States feel that it can be secure by being alone or going it alone? I mean, this is a debate that went on for some time during the aftermath of 9/11, and it's not possible. And with COVID-19 and the current level of challenges we are facing, both in terms of the health pandemics as well as cybersecurity, which both Democrats and Republicans have recognized as one of the major threats. And they have identified Russia, China, and Iran. The Homeland Security has put out a new document which outlines the threats that they face. Is it possible to be, isolationist or be alone and expect the world to actually help you if in case you need it? I mean, how does that work? So stepping back or restraining is theoretically, I think, a very valuable idea, but in implementation, the devil would lie in the details. So I think that's one thing. And final word is about Asia. I think if the commitments in Europe or elsewhere, if the idea of walking away from commitments is part of this disengagement and isolationist impulse, then the start of Quad, the start and the blossoming of the Indo-Pacific strategy, that would cause grave concern. I think what then should one look for? What should it be that you can expect? Which part would you expect a continuity, and which part would you expect would be taken over by the isolationists? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Vijayalakshmi. And I think, Charles, you have enough on your plate for the next few minutes to respond to and to challenge some of the assertions. But over to you.
Thank you very much. That was an incredibly rich and thoughtful set of comments. I will not try to touch on it, on everything. I'd like to leave a little time for the audience to weigh in. So let me just try to touch on the top lines. To Mira's point about, in general, the strategic overreach, I would point out that it actually goes back prior to Afghanistan and Iraq and some of the issues that you justifiably pointed to. This story really does begin in force in the 1990s. When the Berlin Wall goes down, coverage of foreign affairs in the media falls off a cliff. The 1994 elections, Democrats and Republicans start to politicize foreign policy. So that's actually when I began to think about the potential return of some kind of isolationist inward turn. And you'll probably all remember how reluctant Clinton was to get involved in Yugoslavia. So the 1990s was in some ways a warning decade for what came about in reaction to the forever wars. And I think in some ways set the stage for where we are today. I completely share your point about Russia in that I think Russia's most natural position is as a strategic hedge or a pivot state, not a country that ought to be tightly allied to China. And I do believe that one day in the not too distant future, the Russians may wake up and realize that the Chinese are eating their lunch in Central Asia, and that their real threat is not from NATO in Afghanistan or NATO in Ukraine or NATO that Trump is withdrawing troops from, but the rather large country on their eastern flank. And so I do think that it would make sense for a Nixonian moment. However, it requires the Russians to play ball, right? The Russians would need to make a move in eastern Ukraine. They would need to do something on interference in elections. It's a two-way street, but I fully associate myself with your sense of what kind of strategic outreach to Russia should happen under the best circumstances. Many of you mentioned sort of the domestic politics of foreign policy, Congress and polarization, and the sort of, I guess you'd call it the inside-out theory of the case. And I agree with Mira and others who said that external threat matters. I don't think that the United States is going to be ending or trimming its commitments in the Indo-Pacific region. On the contrary, I would say that if this new turn inward is to be felt anywhere, it will be largely felt in the strategic periphery and perhaps in Europe, much less felt in the Indo-Pacific, because there is a bipartisan consensus that China does need to be confronted and that the United States needs to sustain its commitments in the region. That having been said, I'm kind of where Raja is on, can we put the genie back in the bottle? Can we go back to a world in which our fixed alliances are meat and potatoes? And I think we're going to be moving into a more flexible environment in which the alliances are not going to disappear. Even if Trump is reelected, I can't see him withdrawing from NATO. But those fixed alliances, as Raja pointed out, ain't what they used to be, right? We see France and Turkey going after each other, Greece and Turkey. We've now got a war in Nagorno-Karabakh, and nobody knows what to do about it. In the Indo-Pacific region, in some ways, the Quad, which is not really a formal alliance, is emerging as perhaps the go-to forum, as opposed to the traditional U.S. alliance with individual parties. So I think we're headed into a world in which coalitions of the willing, informal groupings, contact groups are going to be much more utilized than in the past. Not, as I said, at the expense of alliances. They're not going to disappear, but I do think that we'll see a shift in emphasis. On the sort of domestic affairs, a number of you mentioned kind of elite differences with the public, elite splits. Both are true. Democrats and Republicans at the elite level have headed in very different directions on foreign policy, and the public has essentially tracked with them. And the liberal internationalist consensus that existed for much of the second half of the 20th century, that's gone at the elite level and at the public level. I do think that a sweet spot in the American political system is a retrenchment of the sort that I'm talking about, in the sense that you can get alliances, political alliances, let's say of the left wing of the Democratic Party, the progressives, who do not like defense spending and foreign war, in alliance with the libertarian wing of the Republican Party, the Tea Party, who basically wants to keep the United States out of foreign entanglements, not because they want to spend more at home on the welfare state, but because they're libertarians. Another issue that I think is important here, and this is again reinforcing the sense of movement toward coalitions of the willing, the Republican Party has embraced a unilateralism that is here to stay. It's hard for me to imagine the Senate ratifying treaties, whether it's the Paris Climate Agreement or an Iran nuclear deal or a new strategic treaty. If we took the post-World War II settlement down to Capitol Hill today, the UN, the Bretton Woods, NATO, they would chase us off the grounds with a baseball bat. And so that the political environment here is very different than it used to be. And I think politicians are going to have to realize that and be much more pragmatic. I think that Biden, who is in the end of the day a political pragmatist, will understand that. But I also think, coming to your question, Raja, that it's going to be a food fight, because you have a strong progressive wing of the Democratic Party that is today behaving itself, but they're not going to behave themselves on November 4th, assuming that Biden wins. They're going to have an agenda on health care, on the welfare state, on Black Lives Matter, on getting out of the Middle East, that will weigh heavily on the president. And I think that there'll be members of the progressive wing in his cabinet. Maybe Elizabeth Warren, maybe Bernie Sanders. He has to do that. And so I do think you are really going to see an interesting array of forces. And as you know, the debate here in the United States right now on many of the issues that we're talking about is a mess, in that you now have this new voice called the restraint school. And many of the people in that camp you will know: John Mearsheimer, Stephen Walt, Barry Posen, and they're basically calling for the United States to get out of the Middle East, get out of Europe, turn NATO over to the Europeans. Some of them even call for the U.S. to go offshore in East Asia. And then you sort of have the liberal internationalists, John Eikenberry, around Biden, Tony Blinken, and Jake Sullivan. And I think their view is, hey, Biden comes back into office, everything should be fine. And what's missing is that middle ground, and that's the ground I'm trying to build intellectually and politically. And I do think it is a home where the restrainers and the liberal internationalists can meet, because it is, in my mind, there is common ground. There is a way of trying to rebuild an internationalist consensus on doing less, but still doing enough. Finally, on the issue about secular expansionism and in general the role of an exceptionalism, I take the points of many of you who said, hey, wait a minute, isolationist? The U.S. was very expansionist. It became an imperial power and has been running the Western Hemisphere ever since. And the answer to that is yes, starting in 1898. Up until 1898, the U.S. really refrained from extended strategic commitments outside of North America. But it is the case that there always has been this hypocrisy at the core of American exceptionalism, right? We are a chosen nation. All men are created equal. Well, except blacks are not. Native Americans are not. We don't really want Latin Americans to be part of the Union. And so there is this kind of strain of who is part of the exceptional experiment. And Trump is tapping into that. Trump is, in appealing to nativism, marrying this sense of exceptionalism in an ethnic and in a racial sense with the isolationism and detachment from the world. And this is something that we've seen going way back in American history. And it is particularly worrisome for me that that brand of nativism sells pretty well with a large segment of the American public. Not, hopefully, a large enough segment to win him victory, but were it not for the pandemic and the degree to which he obviously dropped the ball, I would be very worried about what would happen next Tuesday, because his brand of America First does carry weight with a country and a public that has grown weary of what we've been doing abroad and has grown weary of a form of globalization that they feel has come at the expense of their welfare. So to sum up, I guess I'll borrow the phrase that Raja used. Yes, this is a Goldilocks solution. It is a way of looking for that new middle ground around which a coalition can be built in a country that is today deeply polarized and deeply dysfunctional. I'm someone who is a dyed-in-the-wool internationalist. I believe that the United States should go back to being a team player, that it should remain engaged in core parts of the world, but I worry that we have to be very smart, judicious, and deliberate about how we make that case to the American people and to our like-minded friends abroad.
Thank you, Charles. I know we have run out of time, but I have three questions which sort of cover some broad themes which perhaps you can quickly respond to. One set of questions pertain to a theme that was covered by, I think, in some ways, all three discussants as well. And there is a lot of, as you would expect, there's a lot of interest in India about that question, and that is the question of China. Now, how does American foreign policy establishment today look at this China question? Because on the one hand, you do have, when you talk of a certain foreign policy posture for America, you talk of East Asia or Asia and Europe being the fulcrum around which it can revolve, and retrenchment from other areas. But if China is a global actor, is a global threat, increasingly becoming a global player, then that means that no geography can be, will be left alone. So even when you talk of Middle East, one of the challenges has been that we have seen how rapidly China fills in the vacuum. The fact that Americans moved out of JCPOA meant that China is today Iran's most important partner. So clearly, in a sense, when you're looking at the world and looking at China's rise, how do you interpret it in terms of global political contestation that you have been talking about? And I think that is something that we would like to hear. A lot of us, a lot of members of the audience would also like to hear from you. Talk about that question. The other is, of course, the question of economics and economic decoupling. And now, Mr. Trump, there has been this. You pointed out in your book. The fact that globalization did not benefit everyone equally, the fact there is a lot of discontent about globalization meant that there is a lot of pressure on the American politics to respond to that challenge. And one of the ways in which it has been articulated is that the global economic order has been less beneficial to America than to other countries, particularly China, and therefore let's start recalibrating the economic relationship with China, which does not mean only China, which means a larger set of relationships that are there, larger sets of arrangements that are there. So, whether it's WTO or whether it's RCEP or RCEP in Asia Pacific. So again, when you're looking at the economic dimension of this problem, how does the domestic political contestation respond to that challenge, to this challenge of mapping out this talk of decoupling with the Chinese or with the larger global economic order, to form a different response set? Because we have seen in recent times there is this lot of talk about democracies coming together. Britain has mooted this idea of the democracy should come together and build the 5G network, for example. So are we looking at this fragmentation of a multilateral order, and where you sit in from Washington, how does that look, given that economic decoupling in the last 2 years of Trump administration has moved considerably forward, at least in certain specific sectors? And final question is about the Indo-Pacific, the larger maritime geography of the Indo-Pacific. There are a lot of questions around that that people want to raise. But I think we would just like to hear, in a sense, if the idea is that a lot of middle powers should take on greater responsibility. If the idea is that you can have a lot of these important players in the region who can shoulder greater burdens, America's burden probably should be, can be lessened, and America can therefore manage its domestic political contestation much more effectively. But in a geography where, just the fact that your presence makes such a big difference. The fact that Mr. Trump was not present in the last East Asia summit and the Chinese were present. The fact that Chinese are engaging the region much more robustly, although we have seen in the last year or so, America and Mr. Pompeo in particular being very, very active in the Asian circuit. But clearly there is a sense that American presence is very, very important. There is a new Asia Power Index that Australia's Lowy Institute has just released, and we were talking about it earlier in the day. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that the region and regional players want American presence. They want American presence. They want more of it. So how do you balance that out again with this idea that restraint, yes, but how does that restraint gets operationalized in this dynamic? So I have broadly 3 sets of questions. I know they are huge questions for you to answer in the next few minutes we have, but whatever you can do to help us out. Thank you.
I'll do my best. On the China question, I think at least at the beginning there wouldn't be a great gap between Biden's approach and Trump's approach, in that there are underlying conflicts of interests over trade, security, human rights, and other issues that are not going to go away. There's the North Korea problem, and I think that there will be a head of steam building in a U.S.-China rivalry that will continue to build. I would expect to see the following shifts in the Biden administration. 1, reassurance of allies. The disparaging comments that Trump has made about South Korea and Japan, and maybe we should pull out, and why don't you pick up more of the spending? That kind of talk is going to disappear, and it will be replaced by a "we're back" mantra. We will stand by our friends. That having been said, there will continue to be sensitivity to the issue that you raised, Harsh, and that is, what are others chipping in, and what are others doing to help us share the burden? That is not going to go away. It started under Obama. That's when the whole 2% issue came up, and it will continue, especially in a country that has been hard hit by the pandemic and whose economy is reeling. It's hard to overstate how distressed people are with the situation here at home. I think you'll also see a continued focus on leveling the playing field with China economically, but instead of picking fights with everybody, Biden would mainly pick a fight with China and attempt to form a united front with other countries in confronting China on trade, on intellectual property, on state ownership, and the other issues on the agenda. I do think that there would be a restart of a serious strategic dialogue based upon some kind of policy review. Not to be too disparaging here, but there is no China policy today. There really isn't policy on anything. There is tweet. The president tweets something out and everybody races around Washington trying to figure out what he means. There isn't a policy process. That would come back to life under Biden, and I think it would be coupled with a real effort to engage in strategic dialogue with Beijing. Whether that would amount to anything and lead to a lessening of tensions, it's way too soon to tell, but I think an effort would be made. On China's general strategy, I'll pick up on something that Professor Vijayalakshmi said, and that is that China is pushing out commercially, and it reminds me in many respects of what the United States did in the 19th century. It avoided alliances and it used its commercial reach to build itself economically and also to wield political influence. That's going to continue. The Belt and Road Initiative is coming. It's reaching into Europe. It's putting out tentacles into the Middle East. And yes, it is arriving in Iran, arriving in the Gulf. To be honest with you, I'm not sure that there's much that we can do about that, especially in an era in which there is retrenchment from the Middle East by the United States. I don't think, as I said, that retrenchment will be felt in your part of the world. That is to say that the U.S. is going to be reducing its presence in the Indo-Pacific. That's the one part of the world where I think the presence will increase as the U.S. pivots out of the Middle East. But I do think that the geopolitical landscape is going to be a fluid one, and that countries like India, Russia, the EU are going to be careful about inserting themselves directly in between the US and China as that rivalry builds. In fact, I think one of the more difficult issues for the transatlantic relationship coming up is China. And the degree to which on some days the EU will side with China, on some days the EU will side with the United States. We are not headed to a two-block world. And this comes to the decoupling comment that you raised, Harsh. I don't see decoupling happening. Yes, there'll be some reallocation of supply lines on 5G, on high tech, but it seems to me that we are too tethered together. Our economies are too integrated. Supply lines, manufacturing, investment, it's too far down the road to really imagine us going back to a decoupled world that would look like the Cold War, when you had a capitalist bloc and a non kind of bloc that was under Soviet command economies. And I think because of that, we're just going to live in a messier world where, yes, there is generally an alliance. Alliance is too strong a word, but India working with the United States and others to contain China, but at the same time engage and trade at the same time. My final point is that, you know, I think that the Trump administration is, as I said, instructive about what's going on in the United States. Some of the trend lines will continue. The unilateralism, the turning inward, the focus on rebuilding the economy, particularly in the interior, where deindustrialization has been so pronounced. And I do think that everybody should look for an America that is very, very focused on its domestic issues. I mean, look what it'll be like for the next president. The pandemic needs to be controlled. We've got to have a debate about the future of work, about health care. Racial justice and injustice debates are boiling beneath the surface. Police brutality. It's hard to overstate what the domestic environment feels like here today. But the one note that I'll end with, and this is, I think, a more upbeat assessment, and one that I'm hoping that my colleagues will agree with. In some ways, what worries me most about the Trump era is not America first. It's not picking a fight with China or other countries on trade or talking about NATO. It is turning his back on the guardrails of Republican government, of democracy, of decency, of fact-based politics. I never thought I'd be living through a moment where I am as fearful as I am today about the future of liberal democracy in this country. And I think if liberal democracy in this country stumbles, it may well stumble in other parts of the world. So this is in my mind, one of the most important elections in American history. And what I do have confidence in, if Biden wins, and I know him well, having worked with him in the White House for 3 years, he's a decent man who understands the importance of civility, who understands the importance of restoring integrity to American political life. And so the most important change in my mind that would come on late January of next year if Biden wins is that we will again have a United States that is grounded in democratic values and that works with other democracies around the world to defend decency and human rights and dignity. And it's been very painful for me to see the United States missing in action on those fronts for the last 4 years. I will stop there and express my thanks to all of you for a wonderful set of comments.
Thank you, Charles. It was wonderful to have you today with us and to have your time to to be able to discuss your book in this detail. We have run out of time, but thank you so much once again. And I would recommend this book to everyone who has an interest in global politics, in international affairs, in American foreign policy, because I think it provides you a very distinct lens to understand what perhaps some of the contemporary problems are asking us to envision and to ask us some of the more difficult questions about global politics today. So thank you, Charles, once again, and thanks to Raja, to Ambassador Shankar, to Professor Vijay Lakshmi for giving us your time this evening. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to see you all.
Yeah, wonderful seeing you.